And we're plugged in with Maura Collins. And I am joined today by an amazing friend of mine, the inspirational Dr. Basha Jordan.
Hi.
Hi, Dr. Jordan.
Glad to be here today.
How are you?
I'm excellent. I'm excited about being on your broadcast, which I think is excellent, and I know that you will go far.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
I appreciate you inviting me.
So I met you a couple years ago when I was new to the Tampa Bay area in the fellowship and whatnot. And, you just inspired me. And I started following you on Facebook, watching your videos that you post all the time. And then I loved watching when you were at church, like fellowshipping with the church, being inspirational that way. And then you asked me to come on your show, and you interviewed me, the Hope Doctor.
Right.
You are the Hope Doctor.
That's correct.
So how'd you come up with that?
Well, one day I was in my meditation, and the name of my ministry is Hope Alive Outreach. And so it just came to me one day. I think I was talking to my son on the phone, and it just came to me. You know, I have a slogan that I originated in Baltimore because even though I'm a pastor, I was also in the street with the people. I believe that we need to go out where the people are, and there were a lot of drug dealers in the neighborhood and a lot of drugs around the church. And so when I would go out to minister to the people who are out there using drugs, I would say, treat me like the dope man, only call me the hope man.
Wow, I love it.
Right. And so the dope man always gets respect. You
Okay.
don't argue with a man who's selling you drugs if you want to get served. And so I take the same concept in the arena of outreach to giving people hope. If you want what I have to offer, then you're going to have to make some effort and treat me with respect.
And do what you do, right?
Pardon me?
And do what you do, like follow your way through recovery and the way
Yes.
you lead your life outside of 12-step program, the way you're plugged in, I've noticed with your outreach, with the way you've affected me in my recovery over the past couple of years. You are one of the pillars of, my recovery network, which is, primarily women, but there are some men that I do look up to, that my predecessors that show, me the way and the message of hope. How long have you been in recovery?
Since October the 13th, 1988.
1988.
Right, so this coming October to be 33 years. That's longer than you are old.
I wish. I graduated high school in 1992, so it's right before
Okay.
I went into high school. So, were you in Maryland at that time?
In Maryland,
Baltimore?
yes.
Wow. So, your surrender to the disease, was that something you voluntarily did, or was it a court kind of guided you through, or how did you come into, the recovery program?
Well, as we know, in the second step, it says we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was using, I was insane and didn't know it. And being a pastor and using a drink and a drug, and being in the inner city, and pastoring a medium-sized church in the inner city, well-respected in the community, having drug vigils and marches and that sort of thing to get the young people off of drugs and to educate them about drugs, to have the police department coming in and showing displays of different types of drugs and to influence young people away from drugs. Seeing that I'm there, but I'm high. So living a dual life, I didn't realize that I was really addicted. And I was married for 7 years before my wife found out that I was using drugs. And once she found out that I was using drugs, she proceeded to encourage me in her way to get some help. And I went into an outpatient program for, I'd say maybe a month and a half, 2 months, not really following directions, and because I didn't think that I really needed it. And plus, being a pastor, I didn't want the word to get out that I was a drug addict.
Right.
And so I had told my wife that if she told anybody, especially if she went to the officials, in the church, the bishop, I told her that I would kill her if she did that. And that put a wedge in our marriage, but at the same time, my wife stayed with me. But she was working behind the scenes. And on October the 13th, 1988, there was an intervention in my life. I just bought this farm, and I had this horse that I was going to bring home, and so I'm in the process of having this gentleman was going to put fencing up around, and I'm sitting at my table. It was a Friday morning at 9 o'clock, sitting at my kitchen table talking to him about putting up some fencing, and there was a knock at the door, and I went to open the door, and there was my sister and my mother. And as I opened the door, I said, "Well, why are you all here?" And then I looked behind them, and there was my mother-in-law. And I was going to an Episcopal priest, counselor, and there he was. And then there was my best friend. And then there were 2 officials from the church. And long story short, it was an intervention in my life that day, and I went into treatment. Mm-hmm. And when I went into treatment, my eyes were open first or second day there, mm-hmm. when I realized that I had a disease. And I was glad that I was not what I thought I was.
Right.
So that's how I ended up going into treatment and getting into recovery and finding out about all the nuances of drug and alcohol addiction. I use drugs and alcohol in the same context, in the same sentence, because in our society, there is some diversification in them. However, I learned in the program, 12-step program, that alcohol is a drug.
Right.
And
Amen.
Many people have been confused about that, and I was mm-hmm. confused about that, because at the end of my addiction, it was October the 13th when I went into treatment, but for the past month, I had stopped using cocaine and was just drinking, because I didn't realize the devastation, the addictive qualities of alcohol. So that's how I started in recovery.
That's a very inspiring background, because I've been off narcotics for 13 years, and I had a brief relapse a little over 2 years ago, and it was on alcohol for a couple of months, and it scared me. Like I could see that it became a drug. I thought I could use that socially, and I was scared that it was going to get worse, and I was going to find drugs, and then I'd lose my son and everything else, and I didn't want that to happen. So I just went back to a meeting, and I started over again, and I was honest. So this intervention and your education of the disease, and, you know, in late 80s, early 90s, like the war on drugs was a big thing. And, you know, were you pretty acceptable to go into the public and work outreach? Because like you mentioned, that's the most important thing, what we do outside to stay plugged in outside of 12 steps. How was that accepted? Was it accepted with open arms because you were a member of the clergy and there's anonymity and whatnot? I mean, was it you just all of a sudden said, you know what, I'm going to help other people and I'm okay with being an addict?
Well, in 1988, AIDS was also prevalent in the community. And so many people were dying from AIDS. And when I went away for 30 days, no one knew in the church. They didn't know where I was. And so the rumor was that I had AIDS. They didn't know that I was in a drug treatment facility. And so whenever I minister, whenever I'm talking like this, I try to intertwine and in my conversation recovery. Knowledge is power. A lot of people have heard that statement, but I have something that I have added to that. Knowledge is power if you use it. And so what happened was I was almost like an outcast in my church. When it's important to work the steps in the order in which they are given. And I have learned that through my own mistakes. Because when I came out of treatment, I wanted the people to know where I had been and let them know that I had been using for 30 years of my life. And I had been pastoring that church for 5 years, doing a lot in the community, bringing people into the church, having a good name with the young people. And so when I got out of treatment, that particular day I got out of treatment, there was a counselor who told me that I needed a sponsor. And so the next day I met up with his sponsor, who became my sponsor. And it was on a Friday. And I told him that I wanted to meet with my church, the congregation, to tell them where I'd been and what I'd been doing. And I didn't really know the importance of listening to a sponsor. And so I ignored him and called a meeting of the church. And so here I had all these people in there, the choir, and they're all there. And I stood up and did a fifth step with them. And I devastated them. And they didn't know how to handle it. They couldn't handle it because I had done a total 180 on them. And so the backlash that I had to receive from the congregation was horrific. But fortunately, I was able to stand up where I fell. So I stayed at that church for another 3 years. And during that period, I was able to, since I was in a 12-step program, it's amazing. And I have it in my book, but this book entitled The Pipe and the Pulpit, which it took me 25 years to write this book because there's some things that I have in this book that I was kind of skeptical about putting in there. However, I believe that these incidents will be helpful to individuals who read it because it's real. Or as my son would say, it's for real, for real.
For real, for real.
For real, for real. Yes.
Right.
So for me to be a pastor known throughout the city, and now known to be an addict, God allowed me to use that as a stepping stone.
Right, or a sounding board.
Yes, to do different things. And so now other people were coming into the church. I was ministering to people's sons and daughters who were in the church. And one of the things that I found out, and that is when an individual is an addict or an alcoholic, and they are confronted with someone who is a recovering alcoholic or an addict, an individual who has some influence, and I try to share it with them, the persons in the church who gave me the most hell were individuals who were closet addicts and alcoholics themselves. So I started getting the the help of other recovering addicts in 12-step programs and doing some miraculous things, some unheard of things in the community. I had a drug march where I had a friend of mine who was a mortician, who was also in recovery, and I had him to loan us his hearse and an empty coffin that we had leading the march. And we had some Cadillacs to where individuals, mothers who had lost children, they were riding in the Cadillacs behind the hearse. And when we went through the neighborhood, we would stop on the corner. I mean, if you could imagine 150 addicts in a march with signs and that sort of thing, and stopping on the corner, taking the coffin out of the hearse, setting it on the corner and opening it up, all right, and ministering to people and telling them if they knew of someone who was addicted or someone who had died on this corner. We had people giving out pieces of paper and a pencil and write their name on a piece of paper and put it in the coffin. Then I had other ministers to come and pray, and then we close the coffin up, put it back in the hearse, and go around the corner. So the marches got to be so popular, I ended up having the president of city council and the mayor of the city marching with me.
Wow.
So then God gave me a vision to have a radio broadcast on the #1 station in the nation, Heaven 600, iHeart radio station in Baltimore, where I started a recovery broadcast in 1991. And we've been on now for 30 years. And so I have people calling me from all over, even though I'm here in St. Petersburg, ministering to them. Mothers, grandmothers, fathers, brothers and sisters are horrified when they find out that their loved one is addicted, especially if they have been incarcerated or if they've been in a terrible situation. And people will come to me because, number one, I'm a pastor, and number two, they know that I understand what's going on. So I've made that my life's ministry, my life's outreach. The name of it is Hope Alive Outreach. I use outreach rather than ministry because I don't have a church per se, and people I kind of like slip ministry on it by calling it outreach, but people really want to be ministered to. But there are a lot of people out there who have been disconnected from the church or have been hurt by the church. And so I use the word outreach. I believe that God gives us certain means and ways of helping people that may not be ordinary. They will be extraordinary, but it will be a means to reach that particular individual. And so I'll use any means necessary to help an individual who's suffering. And I don't know who's listening to this broadcast, but if they're professionals listening to this broadcast who are closet addicts or alcoholics, and they put on one face on their job and another face when they're at the bar and another face when they're getting high with other addicts, they are suffering in silence. And by me having suffered in silence, being a pastor, couldn't control my drinking, couldn't control my use of drugs, and couldn't talk to anybody about it. Now I know that there's something worse than dying, which is wanting to die, but you can't. and God wouldn't let me die. Toward the end, I was putting myself in situations where, and being in Baltimore, I mean, Baltimore's got a lot of homicides.
Right.
And so I was putting myself in situations where I should have been killed. I should have died.
I'm so glad you didn't. And that message of hope you just gave is a great hope shot. And I think that we need to have a second or third episode to talk a little bit more about some other topics that I would love to talk to you about if you would come back on the show. Would you be willing?
Sure, yeah.
Thank you so much for being on the show today, Dr. Jordan.
Okay.
You're the best.
All right.
God bless you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.